Appendix 2, picking up the reading, page 1898. The need for this edition and how it was made. We're in section 2, how it was originally edited. The need for editing. One may wonder if the course was simply dictated by an inner voice, why it needed to be edited at all. That's a mouthful. In this case, however, editing was an unavoidable necessity. While later chapters of the text came out virtually ready for publication, that's 11, the minimal editing needed was limited to things like chapter divisions, chapter and section titles, capitalization and punctuation, some paragraphing issues, and very minor wording issues. And while the workbook and the manual were dictated completely with section divisions and titles, none of this was the case with the text's first several chapters. This early material did not come in the form of organized discourses divided into regular paragraphs. Instead, it often jumped around, was interspersed with comments meant only for the scribes, or comments from Helen herself, and sometimes included stray statements without context. Further, there were occasionally scribal errors where either Helen was told that she had not heard correctly or where the terminology or teaching was clearly out of accord with the later course. And there were a number of grammatical errors. This early material then needed a good deal of editing. Editing instructions. Fortunately, there were explicit and implicit editing instructions given by the author. First, the most important instruction, reflected in several things that were said, was that the course needed to be applicable to the general reader rather than reading like something written just to Bill and Helen. Therefore, material that was specific to them in their lives and relationships needed to come out. The author calls this idea of general, I can't say this word, applicability, I did it, the more generalizable quality which the course is aimed at. The final course, in other words, must apply generally to everyone, not just personally to Helen and Bill. Excuse me. Second, when it came to decisions about whether something should be included in the written part of the course at all, or whether you should keep these notes separately because of their personal nature, Bill was placed in charge of these decisions. This was very likely because Helen would not be objective enough to make such decisions. Ken Wapnick said early in the process of the retyping, Jesus told Helen, leave decisions about editing to Bill. At that point, Bill was reasonably sane about the course, and Helen was not. She would have taken out anything that did not read right to her. And that's by Kenneth Wapnick, Ph.D., Editing History, the History of the Manuscripts of A Course in Miracles. And there is the website if you want to look it up. Okay. Indeed, she confessed, I wanted to change just about everything, and that's from Absence of Felicity, 316. Third, scribal errors needed to be corrected. There are several places where the author explicitly corrects something that Helen took down. This same principle would obviously extend to the teachings not identified as scribal errors, yet clearly in conflict with later course teaching. For example, the early dictation states the Holy Spirit is the bringer of revelations, not miracles. Yet this idea that he is not the bringer of miracles is clearly in conflict with later teaching, in which the Holy Spirit is constantly identified as the source of miracles, even being called the bringer of all miracles. What constitutes a scribal error and exactly how much scribal error is present in the early dictation are not easy questions to resolve. However, there is no doubt that there were at least some scribal errors that needed correcting. Fourth, the handwritten dictation was to be treated as the touchstone. In what is now Chapter 5, the author said, "Perhaps I can suggest that the first book of the urtext be gone over again from her notes, not all of which she read correctly." In other words, the urtext, and by extension any later version, was meant to be checked against the notes. Despite any errors that the notes contained, they were praised as a strong testimony to truth, and framed as the touchstone that later versions should be checked against. See Cameo 19 for additional discussion of this, and I'm not going to go there right now, but I know that we'll go back to that. So, the actual editing. The actual editing did accomplish much of the above. The book is edited to be applicable to the general reader. All personal material is either removed or edited to read in a more general way. Also, scribal errors are, with few exceptions, corrected. Early terminology that is inconsistent with the later course is changed to harmonize. The editing displays very little ideological bias, and significantly, the editors appear only to modify what Helen took down. They do not create new material themselves. The editing was governed, in other words, by a clear and overriding attempt to be faithful to the teaching as it was received. The desire to get the author's words right, which is clearly seen in the notes, carried through into the editing, though Helen's editing did get out of hand in the early chapters of the text, as we will see. It was a massive and very delicate job that was done in obvious good faith, with intelligent results. One can only imagine what less faithful and less intelligent hands might have done. The editing, however, was far from perfect. There were serious drawbacks, which we will see as we look at the editing process in more detail. Helen was clearly the primary editor throughout, even though Bill had been assigned the most important part of that job, deciding what would stay in and what would come out. We say with confidence that Helen was the main editor because one can see the same tendencies, the same hand in all of the editing processes that led up to the publication of the course. 15. The editing of the HLC to create the FIP first edition does contain some tendencies not seen in earlier versions: a focus on consistent terminology, a pattern of removing or changing references to behavior, and an emphasis on consistency with the course's metaphysical foundation. Given that these editing tendencies had not appeared in the editing before this point, it seems likely that they are mainly the product of Ken Wapnick. Yet even if this is accurate, it still only concerns a small part of the total picture of the editing. Okay. Where was I? And Helen is the only candidate for whose hand is in that, since she was literally the only one involved in all of the editing processes. We can easily see this by reviewing who was involved in each one. The editing within the notebooks, taking different stabs at rendering the same sentence, was of course Helen's. The editing that occurred while reading the urtext to Bill was Helen's. The handwritten editing on the urtext pages was Helen's. The editing that happened while typing the second draft was Helen's. The editing of the HLC was Helen and Bill's. And the editing of the FIP first edition was Helen and Ken's. In every case, Helen was either sole editor or co-editor. Indeed, in both of those editing processes in which Helen was co-editor, she was actually the lead editor. According to Ken Wapnick, Helen was the main editor with both the HLC done by her and Bill and the first edition by her and Ken. In regard to the editing that Helen and Bill did, Ken said Helen was the editor on their team. Bill did not have the patience for it. And that's 16. That's editing history, the history of the manuscripts. And that's the web address. And in regard to the editing she and Ken did, he said, "It has been suggested, I know, that this editing is something I essentially did on my own, or that I influenced Helen's decisions. Anyone who knew Helen would clearly recognize the absurdity of this idea. No one, including Jesus, could ever get her to do anything she did not want to do. To think that I could have had an influence on Helen is most strange." And that's editing history. Oh, sorry. Pages are thin and hard to turn, so it gives us a break. Ken summarized Helen's role in relation to both Bill's and his own in this way. "You could perhaps think of Bill as her consultant with the HLC and me as her secretary with the FIP, who carried out her wishes." 18, that's personal communication from Ken Wapnick, August 9th, 2004. Yet, if Helen was the actual main editor, why had the author given the key editorial role to Bill? The reason, as we said earlier, was very likely because of Bill's greater objectivity. As Ken said, Helen was a compulsive editor, and that was an absence from Felicity. 348. I don't want to go up and down, so I'll just read it, and then I'll show it at the end. And his compulsivity apparently went into high gear when she was personally uncomfortable with what, and this compulsivity apparently went into high gear when she was personally uncomfortable with what she was editing. This was the case, for instance, with her autobiography. In this regard, Ken reported that recounting certain events in her life, especially those of a religious nature, and even more specifically those events surrounding A Course in Miracles, aroused tremendous anxiety in Helen, and her discomfort directly led to an almost fierce over-editing. That's from Absence of Felicity 1. Because of this, Ken said that the result of him and Helen editing her autobiography proved in many places to be even worse than the original. And that's Absence from Felicity 1. Another example of this compulsive editing was with Helen's poetry, which was published in The Gifts of God and was scribed in a manner similar to the Course. Ken Wapnick related that when he and Helen tried to edit the poems, Helen's compulsive editing took over, often at the expense of the poems. He therefore realized this editing project was a mistake. He said, "I think Helen realized this as well and gladly agreed that we stop." And that's from Absence of Felicity 401. So when it came to writings that Helen was uncomfortable with or embarrassed about, her compulsive editing took over and became almost fierce over-editing, which is often at the expense of the original material. This is highly relevant for the editing of the early chapters of the Course, where most of the editing took place because, in fact, Helen was in fact very ashamed of those chapters. Ken Wapnick wrote, "As the text moves on, the writing becomes more and more beautiful, and the last half of the text is filled with passage upon passage in wonderful blank verse. This is not the case in the first 4 chapters, however, and Helen was always very ashamed of them. In fact, when anyone in the early days would want to see the Course, and she would show the Course to very, very few people, and she wouldn't show them the whole Course, she would just show them really beautiful, rhapsodic, ecstatic passages, and she was always rather ashamed of this early part." and that's from Kenneth Wapnick, the Your Text in the Early Chapters of the Text of A Course in Miracles. And there's the web address, miraclestudies.net. The idea that Helen was ashamed of the early chapters as compared to the more beautiful later chapters affords an important window into what happened with the editing. For when one examines in detail the editing changes that were made in the early chapters, a guiding principle becomes very clear. Make the early chapters read more like the later ones. This is exactly what would be expected if Helen was the main editor, if she was uncomfortable with the early chapters as compared to the later ones. If such discomfort would tend to propel her into an almost fierce over-editing. In short, what is visible in the editing fits, known editing tendencies in Helen. What did this guiding principle mean for the editing? In contrast to the later chapters, let me wait for that to go. In contrast to the later chapters, the early ones are, in their original state, much less lofty, abstract, and poetic, and instead much more concrete, down-to-earth, and plain-spoken. The attempt to make the early chapters read like the later ones then had two main effects. First, it led to removing almost all references to anything specific or concrete, anything you could actually point to in the world. This went way beyond the instruction to remove things that were specific to Helen's and Bill's lives. For example, this comment from chapter 12 was removed. The analysis of the ego's real motivation is the modern equivalent of the Inquisition. This is not at all the kind of specific that the author asked to be removed, as it is indeed entirely applicable to the general reader. It already has that generalizable quality with which the course is aimed at. How is a comment about the Inquisition applicable only to Helen and Bill? This bias against anything specific and concrete resulted in the removal of several major topics in the early chapters. These include lengthy discussions of sex, of how the Course's teaching relates to the teachings of Freud and Edgar Cayce, and of the Course's model of the mind, in which the mind is depicted as having a conscious level sandwiched between a superconscious level and two unconscious levels. The list of topics removed also includes a host of specific topics mentioned more briefly. These include Carl Jung's archetypes and collective unconscious, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Otto Rank's emphasis on will, and Neo-Freudian's behavioralism, mental retardation, various issues in statics, psychological tests, negative numbers in mathematics, parallel lines in geometry, homosexuality, selection of romantic partners, parenting, relationships with parents, psychotherapy, astrologer Jeannie Dixon, angels, demons, earthbound spirits, reincarnation, karma, spirit possession, speaking in tongues, witchcraft, auras, Christian Science, the records similar to the Akashic records, the celestial speed-up, cryonics, perpetual motion machines, alchemy, the Holocaust, daylight savings time, the CIA, money, voting, machines, kleptomania, gambling, alcoholism, ESP, Cognito, Don Quixote's quotes from Shakespeare and Chaucerian, references to common expressions such as think big and live and let live, and more. None of these topics were specific to the lives of Helen and Bill. All were removed. Second, making the early chapters read like the later ones led to making the early language less informal, emphatic, plain-spoken, and down-to-earth. The resulting language is more formal and elegant, and indeed is often an improvement, as it can be seen in these examples. So I'm going to just read this, and then let me see how much further we have. I'll just read this, and then I'll probably take a break. I don't want this to be too long. We still have a ways to go here. All right, original dictation. He does not hold the evil deeds of a man even against himself. Is it likely then that he would hold against any man the evil that another did? He does not hold your evil deeds against you. Is it likely that he would hold them against me? When an individual has a authority problem, it is always because he believes he is the author of himself and resents his own projection that you share his delusion in this respect. When you have an authority problem, it is always because you believe you are the author of yourself and project your delusion onto others. The flip side of this, however, is that the language in the edited version also tends to be more vague, often lacking the crispness, color, and vitality of the original. As a result, one can see throughout the early chapters a frequent flattening of the language. Note the examples from Chapter 2. Before it is safe to let miracle workers loose in this world, before miracle workers are ready to undertake their function in this world, because of the real strength of its vision, it pulls the will into its own service and forces the mind to concur. Because of the strength of its vision, it brings the mind into its service. If they are inappropriately exposed to a stray and undiluted miracle, if they are prematurely exposed to a miracle, it is certainly much more useful for me to remind you that you do not guard your thoughts at all carefully, except for a relatively small part of the day and somewhat inconsistently even then. It is much more helpful to remind you that you do not guard your thoughts carefully enough. In addition to this flattening, the language is also more compressed, so that the reader is often taken from a series of ideas much more quickly and abruptly, without the time to take in each new turn of thought. For example, in Chapter 1, a discussion billed as the only one which deals with the concept of lack is cut in half, from 530 words to 270. In Chapter 2, a discussion of the power of the mind is reduced from 1,200 words to 500. Whereas the principle of removing specifics resulting in taking out large volumes of teaching, the principle of changing the character of the early language resulted in massive line-by-line editing. As a result, by our count, only 21% of the sentences in the FIP version of the first 4 chapters retain the original wording. And I am going to stop there. We will pick up on page 1906. Thank you for joining with me. I love you. I don't want to get behind from the group that I'm in, but this is more important, so we will catch up. I don't know if you're in the group with me or not, but I think this is important to read, so before we get into the course. Oops, sorry. Dropped my phone. I love you. Thank you for joining. And I didn't pray when I started this. I apologize. Open mind, new experience. Open mind, new experience.